Historians today continue to return to the Cannon case not out of morbid fascination, but because it reveals so starkly the fissures in early American law and conscience. Jurisdictional confusion made interstate crimes easy to commit. Local biases meant that some victims mattered less to those in power. Infrastructure was thin. No telegraphs yet, no centralized police forces, no rapid communication between counties. News traveled on horseback or not at all. Into these gaps stepped people willing to exploit them. Yet even in that bleakness, there were glimmers of resistance. Individuals and communities who tried to push back. Mayor Joseph Watson's persistence, the courage of witnesses who risked retaliation, the quiet work of abolitionists who helped survivors rebuild their lives. These were the counterweights to the darkness. They did not erase the crimes, but they made the truth visible. The land around Reliance eventually healed in a superficial way. New houses were built, farms expanded, and children grew up unaware of the bones that once lay beneath their fields. But the older generations remembered. Some refused to speak of the past. Others insisted that the story be told, not for the thrill of it, but for the lesson it carried. Even now, descendants of those communities feel the chill of that history when the topic arises, a reminder of how close cruelty can live to ordinary life, how silently it can root itself when the conditions are right. The question that lingers, the one asked by researchers and descendants alike, is whether the full extent of the Cannon network will ever be known. It is likely that much of it has been lost. Records decayed, graves were plowed over, survivors died without leaving written testimony. The enterprise was designed to vanish its victims, to fold them into the vast machinery of the southern plantations, where they would become indistinguishable from legally ensnared laborers. Even so, enough fragments remain to ensure that the memory doesn't disappear entirely. The testimonies of Lydia Smith and Cyrus James, the court documents, the newspaper articles, the skeletal remains. These form the fragile architecture of remembrance. They press upon us the reality that the darkest crimes rarely arise suddenly. They grow from neglect, from prejudice, from a willingness to look away. What we inherit from the Cannon case is not just a story of a single woman's cruelty, but a warning etched across the early fabric of the nation. It tells us that vigilance matters, that communities must protect their most vulnerable, that law must be flexible enough to cross borders when criminals do, and that the humanity of every person must be recognized if justice is to mean anything at all. The last chapter of Patty Cannon's life ended behind a locked door, her final act one of control rather than submission. But the story does not end with her. It continues in the voices that speak her name as caution, in the unresolved questions that haunt the archival record, in the shadows of the Delmarva Peninsula, where the past has never fully settled. And so we ask, as generations before us have asked, how much of her story was uncovered, and how much still lies buried, waiting for a future plow to find what the present cannot yet see. Still, the immediate legal fallout was uneven. Some members of the Cannon-Johnson network vanished into the shifting geography of the Deep South. There, the trade in human beings was vast enough to swallow men whole, allowing them to adopt new identities or embed themselves in enterprises less conspicuous than Cannon's, but no less violent. Warrants were issued, rewards announced, yet little came of the pursuit. The law of that era was a net with too wide a weave. If a suspect could travel 50 or 100 miles, the chance of capture diminished almost to nothing. The victims, meanwhile, remained largely uncounted. Families in Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware, and New Jersey whispered about sons and daughters who had disappeared on a walk to work, or on an errand, or on a journey they believed would change their fortunes. For many, suspicion turned gradually into certainty. Their loved ones had been taken south. But the plantations where kidnapped people were sold did not keep the kind of records that allowed for reclamation. Most victims, if they survived the journey, would live out the rest of their lives far from the places that remembered their names. Writers, preachers, and local storytellers began to reshape the narrative, sometimes faithfully, sometimes with embellishments. By the late 19th century, the tale of Patty Cannon had drifted between history and folklore. Books and serialized stories used her as a symbol of frontier depravity or as a cautionary figure, a monstrous woman who inverted expected roles. George Alfred Townsend's novel, The Entailed Hat, turned her into literature, bending fact to suit the melodrama of the age. Readers devoured the story, often unaware of how many real lives had been lost behind its fictionalized veneer. Tourists eventually followed the legend. They sought out the Cannon House long after its timbers had darkened and its roof sagged. Guides, some earnest, some opportunistic, pointed to places where they said the boxes had been unearthed, or where a hidden room once stood. A kind of morbid industry grew around the site, one that made older residents uncomfortable but was difficult to stop. Even after the house was demolished in 1948, people continued to visit the empty land, trying to sense some lingering trace of what had transpired. Time had smoothed over the wounds, but it had not erased them. The remains of Patty Cannon herself endured a strange, unsettling journey. Her burial in the Georgetown jail yard was done quietly, almost with relief, as if the earth itself was expected to swallow the ugliness she represented. But when new construction later claimed that patch of ground, her bones were disinterred and relocated. Her skull, separated from the rest of her remains, became an object of grim fascination. For decades, it was displayed in various locations, including a public library in Dover, a macabre relic in a glass case, meant perhaps as a warning, but revealing also a persistent appetite for spectacle. Eventually, the skull disappeared from public view, though rumors about its whereabouts have never fully died. As disturbing as this treatment was, it reflected a deeper problem: the ease with which stories about villains become curiosities, while the stories of victims fade into silence. The Reverse Underground Railroad, as historians later named it, was more than a single gang or a single woman's cruelty. It was a shadow system that thrived because the larger society allowed it to, a mirror image of the networks that helped enslaved people escape northward. For every path carved toward freedom, another wound downward toward captivity. The Cannon case left an imprint that would not fade easily. The place once called Johnson's Crossroads would be renamed Reliance, as if geography might cleanse memory. Property values hovered low. Gossip hardened into legend. Newspapers and later pamphleteers would blend fact and fiction, recasting Patty Cannon in grotesque caricature or as an almost mythic embodiment of vice. Her body, initially interred in the Georgetown yard and later moved, was subject to morbid curiosities. Her skull separated and displayed in public spaces, a macabre relic that strangers would gawk at for decades. Such treatment, grotesque in its own right, reflected a society at once repulsed and fascinated, unable to entirely consign the tale to oblivion, yet uncertain how to commemorate the victims with dignity. More enduring than the sensationalism, the legal and moral questions the case raised lingered. The Cannon saga highlighted how racial indifference, legal fragmentation, and economic incentives could conspire to create a trafficking apparatus that thrived in plain sight. It underscored the limits of early 19th century law enforcement and foreshadowed the need for coordinated responses to interstate crime. And it left a ledger of loss that historians still try to read with whatever empathy the surviving fragments will allow. The ground on which those wooden boxes had been dug remained ordinary on its surface. Crops, fences, the routine of seasons. But underneath was an accounting of human ruin. The reverse of the Underground Railroad had been built on the same roads and riverways that other networks used to carry people toward freedom. In the shadow of those paths, the cannon operation reminds us of a truth every historian learns reluctantly. Liberty and bondage run parallel in the same landscape, and often the difference between the two depends on the attention and the courage of those who will not look away. Many people prefer not to look too closely at certain chapters of the past. They become blurred by convenience, softened by distance. But the aftermath of the Cannon investigation refused to dissolve so easily. The state tried to fold the horror away, yet the echoes remained. In legal reforms, in folklore, in the families left searching for loved ones who never returned. It would take decades for the land itself to stop being spoken of as cursed, for travelers to pass through without glancing uneasily at the tree line. Even after Cannon's death, investigators continued to examine what she had left behind. The full scope of the gang's activities could not be neatly tallied. Records slipped across borders, victims vanished into states that kept no trace of their arrival, witnesses were scattered or afraid. Still, authorities concluded that the crimes discovered in that patchwork of fields represented only one visible corner of a hidden empire. The trafficking routes sprawled across the eastern seaboard, linking northern cities with southern markets, where silence was easy to purchase, and where questions asked too loudly could be met with violence. The local community tried to distance itself from the stain. Reliance, the new name chosen to replace Johnson's Crossroads, was meant to signal a fresh beginning. But names are fragile shields, and memory has a way of seeping through cracks. For years afterward, children were warned not to wander alone near certain woods. Stories circulated of strange sounds at night, of lantern light moving across fallow fields where no traveler should be. These rumors, threaded with fear, became another kind of inheritance. Yet beneath the superstition and the lingering dread were sharper truths about the time. How easily a society can lose track of those it has chosen not to protect. How criminality flourishes when prejudice creates blind spots in the law. The Cannon case forced uncomfortable conversations, even outside Delaware. Newspapers in Philadelphia and Baltimore carried the story. Abolitionist circles used it as evidence of the systemic danger facing free African-Americans. Legislators debated the need for clearer jurisdiction across state borders and for stronger safeguards for those whose freedom depended on flimsy documents and reluctant courts. The prosecution's backbone was Cyrus James. His testimony, supplemented by Lydia Smith's account and the dug-up remains, made a case that was difficult to dislodge. The state marshaled witnesses who would place wagons at certain times, who would swear to the smell of smoke on a particular night, to the sound of digging. The pattern of similarly constructed wooden boxes and the identical locations of burial placed the Cannon's crimes in a continuity rather than in scattered, excusable anomalies. The law, which for years had been pliable and inattentive, now moved with a new, if belated, firmness. Yet Patty Cannon remained defiant, even as the web closed. Accounts from her confinement show a woman who refused to shrink. She spoke without contrition, sometimes with an almost clinical air, reducing murder to business necessity. Her demeanor unnerved the jailers. The Sussex County Jail in Georgetown was a grim, stone place built for petty offenders, not for a defendant of such notoriety. She was kept under close watch beneath reinforced bars. Jailers reported her as a figure of stubbornness, still commanding the loyalty and fear she had cultivated, still lucid enough to mock the proceedings. When defendants in capital cases then faced the gallows, motive and calculation mattered to juries. The prosecution offered both: a market motive tied to booming cotton and the stabilizing practice of disposing of witnesses to preserve the enterprise. The defense had little to offer beyond plea for mercy on account of age and gender, claims that, in the face of mass graves and corroborated testimony, rang thin. Court sessions were expected to move quickly. The evidence, by the standards of the day, seemed overwhelming. But the case never reached the moral accounting the public demanded. Before she could stand trial, and before a jury could pronounce sentence, Patty Cannon's story ended in a locked cell. On May 11, 1829, she was found dead, the official cause listed as suicide by poison. A small vial, later identified as containing arsenic, had been hidden in her clothing. How the substance entered the jail remained uncertain. Visitors were not searched as thoroughly as modern procedure would require. Sympathizers might have smuggled it, or she might have planned the act herself, stockpiling the means across months of confinement. The ambiguity of her death added a final, grotesque flourish to the narrative. Escape by one last assertion of control. Her suicide deprived the victims' families of the formal satisfaction of legal retribution. It also curtailed the fuller exposure of the gang's network. Some conspirators fled south and melted into the vast geography of the Deep South, where Delaware's reach could not pursue them easily. Joseph Johnson and his brother Ebenezer disappeared into the southern states. Local authorities made few successful efforts to recover them. The legal and logistical limits of the period, slow communications, jurisdictional hems and gaps, and the lack of a federal law enforcement apparatus, allowed many threads to lose their ends. Cyrus James's fate, however, bent in another direction. Recognizing that he had been coerced from childhood and that his testimony had been essential, Delaware courts spared him the gallows. He was freed, assisted by abolitionist sympathizers, and relocated to Pennsylvania, where he was given protection and a chance to reweave a life. Accounts suggest he later worked with legitimate anti-slavery networks, applying the knowledge and trauma of his past toward resisting the very trade he had been forced to serve. In that small redemption lay an eerie symmetry, a boy raised to lure the vulnerable who lived long enough to pull others away from the same snare. In the wake of the Cannon uncovering, the scale of damage became a matter of estimate and horror. Conservative calculations suggest the gang may have trafficked hundreds, perhaps between 500 and 1,000 people into the Deep South over its years of operation. Each number represented a stolen life, a family rent and rearranged, a person forced into decades of labor under other names. Many victims were never recovered, their fates closed in the anonymity of faraway plantations. The economic sum of the crime, measured against the prices of human beings in southern markets, translated into a fortune that, in today's terms, would be measured in the millions. Lydia's account was corroborated by others. Freed men who had escaped an escort, a farmer who remembered a wagon arriving late and leaving soon after, servants who had been paid in coin and told to look the other way. The gang had been meticulous in erasing documentation. Free papers were seized and destroyed, names were changed, any trace of a prior life smoothed away like footprints in mud. Those who resisted, were beaten until submission replaced memory. Those who managed to flee often carried only fragments of a story, like a torn garment of testimony that had to be stitched into a prosecutable case. Pressure from outside the region helped turn those fragments into a net. Joseph Watson of Philadelphia, a Quaker whose conscience would not be quieted, began to follow the pattern of disappearances from his city. He offered rewards. He collected affidavits. He pushed for cooperation between states that had long been content to conduct their own small affairs and ignore cross-border crimes. The money Watson offered was consequential. In an era when $500 could be the equivalent of several months' wages, the reward loosened tongues. Former associates, frightened or resentful, began to speak. Dissatisfied gang members and escaped victims provided names and routes. Under that pressure, the Cannon operation did not shrink. It retaliated, with more secrecy, more violence, and more murders. The gang's most dangerous vulnerability was not geography, but the small human fissure that occurs when a man or woman who has been coerced finally cares enough about his own soul to betray the master who broke him. That fissure opened in the form of Cyrus James, a mixed-race boy purchased at 7 and raised inside the Cannon household. As he grew, so did his knowledge of how the enterprise worked, who transported people, which boxes were brought out at midnight, where straps and chains were hidden. He had been trained to lure, to act as a decoy, to smile and invite a trust that would become captivity. Yet the violence he had witnessed, children beaten to silence, bodies wrapped and buried, ate at him. When authorities finally caught him attempting to flee, the choice laid itself bare: remain complicit and face execution, or tell everything and cling to the hope of mercy. Cyrus's testimony was surgical. Under oath, he narrated the geography of crimes as if reading from a map only he could see. The exact fields where bodies were buried, the chests constructed for human concealment, the sequence of events when a slave trader arrived and was plied with drink and then shot in the dark. He spoke of being forced to help carry bodies, to assist in the burial, to help clean rooms so they might once again appear ordinary to unwitting travelers. He named Joseph Johnson, Ebenezer Johnson, and Patty Cannon as killers of the Georgia trader whose bones the plow had revealed. He described the child killed in the garden, a mixed-race boy whose life Cannon snuffed because she feared the implications of his paternity, and other infants and children who were buried in wooden boxes in the yard. Having Cyrus lead them, authorities methodically dug. They found what he said they would: boxed remains, layers of earth disturbed in calculated patches, the frequent reappearance of similarly constructed coffers for concealment. The physical evidence matched his words. Where testimony alone might have been dismissed as vengeance or invention, the soil confirmed the stories. And one discovery in a garden patch was especially damning: the bones of a young child, mixed in with the roots of vegetables, a daily reminder that beneath the ordinary land was a catalog of atrocity. Public reaction was swift and insistent. For decades, the crimes against African Americans had been invisible to much of white society. Missing black people could be ignored because the social calculus deemed them less than citizens whose loss required redress. When white slave traders, men who trafficked in human lives legally, began to vanish, the tenor shifted. Financial backers in the South, merchants and relatives with power and voice, demanded investigation. The gang's practice of murdering rival traders to steal cash and human cargo had been a grisly form of market consolidation. It also created witnesses who were too important to vanish without consequence. On April 13, 1829, a Delaware grand jury indicted Martha Patty Cannon on 4 counts of murder. The charges were specific, naming victims and dates: an infant female, a male child, an adult male, and a Negro boy, crimes spanning nearly a decade. The indictment, prepared by Attorney General James Rogers, was extraordinary for its precision and for the simple fact that it targeted a white woman for killing African Americans, a legal move that reflected the piling weight of evidence and a new unwillingness, however partial, to let jurisdictional gaps shield such brutality. Local law enforcement in that isolated corner was weak at best, corrupt or complacent at worst. Sparse white populations, transient laborers, and a culture of minding one's own business created a protective fog. That indifference, or active collusion, allowed illicit ventures to grow. It was within this climate of neglect that Patty's criminal transformation accelerated, fed by marriages and alliances that stitched together a network of captors and traffickers. The first marriage into that network was to Henry Brighton, a blacksmith who doubled as a kidnapper. His legitimate work gave him cover. As he traveled to shoe horses and mend tools, he watched and learned which households might hide a young laborer or a promising child. In 1811, he was arrested in Georgetown for kidnapping, but he escaped. The pattern that followed, deception, violence, and the quiet conveyor belt removal of people from their homes, would be repeated with a refined cruelty. It was after Brighton's escape that the first murder tied to the Cannon Circle occurred. A slave trader known to history only as Rigidal walked into Cannon's tavern and into a trap. Plied with drink, robbed, and ultimately gunned down, Rigidal's body was hastily buried on the property. Brighton and an accomplice, Joseph Griffith, were later captured and hanged in April of 1813. Patty Cannon escaped prosecution. Rather than deter the enterprise, the episode hardened it. Murder had proven useful. The lesson taken was not that crime failed, but that criminals required better organization and stricter control to evade detection. When Patty's daughter remarried, this time to Joseph Johnson, the operation matured. Johnson was not merely a brute. He was a man with logistics, connections in the South, and capital. The means to move from opportunistic abduction to a regional trafficking business. His tavern, famously sitting on the state line, offered a peculiar advantage: rooms that technically lay in different states, where suspects could step across a threshold to evade an oncoming warrant. What looked like geography became a legal sleight of hand. The tavern was more than a public house. Its common room, its bar, its apparent bustle of legitimate trade masked a subterrane of purpose-built hiding places. Concealed doors, cellars, and tunnels muffled voices and chained bodies. Iron rings set into stone, small ventilation shafts, and carefully constructed boxes hinted at methodical preparation. The gang that gathered around Cannon and Johnson was diverse and strategic. White criminals, mixed-race decoys like John Purnell, who moved between communities, and enslaved people forced into roles that obscured the gang's movements. Purnell, with his ability to pass in different social circles, was invaluable as scout and bait. By the 1820s, the Cannon-Johnson network had stretched far beyond Johnson's crossroads. Routes led from Pennsylvania to Louisiana. Buyers waited in Alabama and Mississippi, and a Quaker mayor in Philadelphia, Joseph Watson, began to map an ugly pattern. Kidnappings traced back to the Delmarva Peninsula with alarming regularity. The victims were chosen for vulnerability: the young, the poor, the unprotected. Children, prized for their long, trainable labor, were taken and broken. The gang's methods were industrial in their efficiency: false offers of employment, blinding journeys in the dark. chains and new names conferred before sale. Testimonies would later describe the subterranean world where captives awaited sale, stripped of papers that proved their freedom, reduced to cargo ready for the southern market. Lydia Smith's testimony would later give the prosecution something many of these cases lacked: a living, trembling voice to translate the cold facts into human suffering. Kidnapped in 1825, she remembered the hands on her, the blindfold, the wagon that smelled of leather and damp men, the endless dark. She described being moved from Cannon's house to Johnson's tavern, shackled and hungry, her days measured by the clink of chains and the cadence of other people's sobs. For 5 months, she lived in a subterranean cell, she said, where the air tasted of stale bread and fear. Her rescue, orchestrated through networks that refused to let her disappear, would be one of the threads that began to unravel the gang's carefully sewn cloak of secrecy. In the damp spring of 1829, a plow horse stumbling in a low, reclaimed field did something that the law and the comfortable had failed to do for years. It pulled back a corner of the landscape and showed what lay beneath. The tenant farmer expected a sinkhole, an old well, a chance misstep. Instead, his plow hit wood. He dug, and he found a chest. When he opened it, the world that had been easy to ignore became suddenly, violently obvious. A human skeleton, yellowed with time. A skull scarred by deliberate force. That single unearthing would loosen a long-hidden horror and begin the slow, shuddering unraveling of a criminal enterprise that had flourished along the Mason-Dixon line. Over the following weeks, men with shovels and officials with warrants would unearth at least 7 bodies on that same property, 3 of them children. Names that had been muttered in fear, names people hoped were only rumor, took on cold, prosecutable reality. The woman at the center of it all was Martha Patty Cannon. Her name already existed in low, terrified whispers across the Delmarva Peninsula. For nearly 2 decades, she had been the axis of something historians now call the Reverse Underground Railroad, a network that hunted free African Americans and escaped slaves, funneling them back into bondage for sale in the Deep South. But profit alone does not account for the kind of violence that stained Cannon's hands. She was also, the evidence would suggest, a serial killer, eliminating witnesses, rivals, and even children who might jeopardize the trade. The region where she built her empire mattered. In the early 1800s, the land now called Reliance lay at a confusing junction. Sussex County and Delaware rubbing shoulders with Caroline and Dorchester counties in Maryland. Jurisdictions met and frayed there. Law could be outrun by the simple step of crossing a line. Locals called the place Johnson's Crossroads, named for the tavern that, in time, became the nerve center of the most notorious kidnapping ring America had yet seen. The landscape was a conspirator. Miles of pine and oak and marsh, small clearings with isolated farmsteads, the Nantoki River threading darkly through the region and offering quiet waterborne escape routes. Roads were no more than cart tracks. Towns were days away by horse. For those who wanted to live or thrive beyond the reach of law, it was almost providential. Martha, Patty to those who knew her, arrived in that borderland sometime around 1790. Court notes suggest a birth around 1760, perhaps under the name Lucretia Patricia Hanley, though she kept her past deliberately misty. Some claimed she came from Canada and wandered to Delaware as a teenager. What is certain is her marriage to Jesse Cannon, a farmer whose land, crucially, straddled the state line. Their life at first glance was unremarkable. A modest 2-story house of timber and small windows, fields of tobacco and corn, a quiet man who kept to himself. What neighbors did not know were the secreted rooms and hidden spaces the house would acquire. Cavities for human beings, engineered to muffle breath and erase identity. All of this unfolded against a larger, more brutal economy. The early 1800s were a pivotal moment for American slavery. After Congress banned the importation of enslaved people from Africa in 1808, demand in the booming cotton fields of Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia drove prices skyward. A healthy adult who might once have sold for $300 could now fetch over $1,000 in the Deep South. The invention of the cotton gin had made cotton king and human beings the currency that minted fortunes. With legal import closed, traffickers turned inward, toward domestic capture and the reinsertion of free African-Americans into bondage. The Delmarva Peninsula, with substantial communities of legally free black people who worked as laborers, artisans, and farmers, became a vulnerable borderland. Freed by gradual emancipation laws or by individual manumissions after the Revolutionary War, these communities lacked powerful protectors. Their freedom rested on paper that could be disputed, on courts that often refused them voice. That precarity was exploitable. Patty Cannon was a force that lived within those exploitations. Contemporary descriptions leave little ambiguity. She was large, physically imposing, almost monumentally strong for a woman of her era, near 6 feet tall when most women barely reached 5. She had a deep, commanding voice and an intensity that neighbors remembered as terrifying. Her husband Jesse's death, around 1826, was shrouded in rumor. Some later whispered of poison. Widowed and in possession of the vital, border-straddling property, she had by then already built connections that would make her name synonymous with terror.